This episode of Warp 5 is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the non-profit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org. And if you want to join in on the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode or any other, please join the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type Babel, that's Babel, into the Facebook search field. We look forward to seeing you there.
Hi, this is Tucker Smallwood from Star Trek Enterprise. You're listening to Trek FM.
How we doing, Trip? Ready when you are. Prepare for warp.
Course laid in, sir. Request permission to get underway. Let's go.
Welcome, Boomers, to another episode of Warp 5. I'm your host today, Brandon-Shea Mutala. Floyd was unable to join me today because we had to record this interview on a Sunday, and Floyd was busy with family stuff, so I had to take the reins on it. I'm a little bit sad about that, but not completely sad because I got to spend an hour and 15 minutes discussing Star Trek and the Golden Girls and the Orville with David A. Goodman. We're gonna have a wonderful interview for you guys, and we've been trying very hard for several months to get this interview set up, and we finally managed to make it happen. It seemed like every time something would either come up for David or something would come up for me, and it kept preventing the interview from occurring. So finally, we were able to knock it out. We had a great time discussing his career. And David A. Goodman, he's known for a lot of stuff. I mean, currently he's producer on The Orville, and he's been the executive producer on Family Guy, on American Dad, and he's even gone all the way back with Star Trek Enterprise. He was a consulting producer there, and he wrote 4 wonderful episodes. He wrote the episode of Futurama called Where No Fan Has Gone Before, and he started his career on the Golden Girls, which holds a special place in my heart. And for patrons of the network, Justin Ozer and Tim Robertson and I, we created a commentary for the episode that David A. Goodman wrote the teleplay for, which was called The Impotence of Being Earnest. And you can get that by becoming a patron of the network at the $5 per month level or higher. It's just a special little fun episode that we put out. But I don't want to take up any time because it's a great interview. It's a long interview. We had a great conversation. So let's bring David Goodman in to discuss his career. Well, thank you very much, David, for joining us. I really appreciate it. How are you doing today?
I'm doing just great, Brandon. Thank you.
Excellent. So one of the first things that we do when we get a guest on Warp 5 is we ask them a little bit about their history with Star Trek and how it was their fandom with Star Trek came about.
I was just thinking about that the other day. When I was really little, Star Trek was on the air in its original airing on the network on NBC, and I was young, and it was in my mind a show that was very scary. I think I saw a clip of the Gorn episode. I walked into my uncle's house, and he was watching it, and the Gorn episode was on, and I was very scared by that. So I didn't watch it, even though I was alive. I didn't watch it in its original airing. And then somehow in the 70s, I had two cousins, actually, both named Michael, on different sides of my family. And they were both Star Trek fans. One, a guy named Mike Metley, who was a kind of a big fan, maybe known in fan circles. And my other cousin, Michael Kaufman. And they were both Star Trek fans. And so I started watching it, and I was probably around 10 or 11. And it was rerun 5 nights a week, or maybe sometimes 6 nights, on Channel 11 in New York. And I started watching, and then I somehow hooked into that thing that used to happen back before VCRs and DVRs and DVDs, and was the only way to become a complete fan was to see the episode when it aired. So I started keeping track. I think I got a copy of The Making of Star Trek and The World of Star Trek, which had episodes guides in them. And that's, again, before the internet, so I started keeping track of which episodes I'd seen. And I started, really becoming very kind of passionate about this show and wanting to see every episode. Actually, the last episode I saw, it took me, the way syndication works, you run through the 79 episodes in about, well, how many weeks is that? 14, 15 weeks. And I kept missing, crap, I'm forgetting. I'm blanking on the name. What kind of Star Trek fan? I'm blanking on the name. It'll come to me in just a second. The Jack the Ripper episode.
Wolf in the Fold.
Wolf in the Fold. I kept missing Wolf in the Fold. So that was the last Star Trek episode I saw. I don't remember the first episode I saw, but I remember that was, and I remember this feeling of completion that I'd seen them all, and obviously many of them more than once, because you're not home every night at 6, or you have a school function, or you're away on vacation with your family, or your sister gets control of the television one night, or whatever. It took me a long time. It took me probably a couple of years to see every episode. And during that process, I became more and more of a diehard fan, of which I am still to this day.
Yeah, that's very kind of similar to mine. Like, it was on CBC television up here in Canada, and it was on at 3:30, which is right after school. And how I was making sure that I was watching them was I had the 1991 compilation books that were the James Blish, but done in like the chronological production order. Uh-huh. And CBC aired them in production order, which is my preferred method for watching them. And I remember my surprise when I came across the Mud episodes, because Blish didn't do the writing for those two. Some of these, they were like, these new episodes that I'd like never heard of and whatnot. So that was pretty amazing for me.
Yeah, I know this writer, Jane Espenson. I don't know if you know that name. No. Jane, she wrote for Deep Space Nine, and she wrote for Battlestar Galactica, and she's a big writer on Buffy, and she currently writes on Once Upon a Time. And she told me that her exposure to Star Trek were actually Star Trek novels, not the Blish novels, but she had started, she didn't even get to watch it. She was reading Diane Duane's books, before she even saw it. So people find their way to this show in so many different ways. And then it was around that time, I think, the animated series came on, and that was a very hard show to catch. Mm-hmm. I think I missed it in its first airing. I saw a few, but it's funny how you find your way to it.
Mm-hmm. So would you say that original series is your favorite?
I guess. I don't like to say favorite, but it's certainly the one I've seen the most. Mm-hmm. But I can find myself plowing through all the episodes of Voyager. I mean, I'm just there's sort of moments that each series has that you find yourself enjoying in some way. But because I've been watching original series the longest, that was the first series released on VHS, so I collected them on VHS. As a kid, I used a cassette recorder to record 2 or 3 of my favorite episodes. So to this day, I could probably recite all the dialogue from Mirror Mirror, just because I would listen to that cassette tape over and over again. So there's a way in which that the original series is definitely sort of in my bones in a way that I think, no pun intended, in my bones in a way that the other shows aren't. Although I love them all.
Mm-hmm. Right on.
What's your favorite?
My favorite series overall is Deep Space Nine, followed by the original series. Uh-huh. And since I've taken over Warp 5, Enterprise has definitely climbed up to probably be my third favorite of them.
Oh, neat.
Of the series.
Well, that's good. It's good if you're doing Warp 5 that it's at least your third favorite. That's the sad thing about Enterprise. It can only get that high. I'm a guy who does the Warp 5 podcast.
So tell us about your first writing gig on the Golden Girls. How did you break into writing, and how did you get involved with the Golden Girls? And before you say that, like when I was young, like I'm a bit younger than you, I'm sure. Like I was born in '81, and when we were young, 6 or 7 years old, at supper time, one night of the week, I would get to choose the TV show while we ate supper, and my sister would get to choose the next day. And I don't remember what it was my sister wanted to watch, but I was like 6 years old, and I always wanted to watch the Golden Girls. Like ever since I was a young kid, I always loved that show. So now you wrote one episode for it.
I was on the show for 2 seasons, so I contributed a lot during those seasons. I had a writing partner at the time, and he and I had been essentially assistants to producers in New York City, and my boss had worked for the years before. She had been a writer, and she was a writer, and she submitted me and my partner's work to the producers of the Golden Girls, and they hired us. I mean, it's really as simple as that. We were pretty young. I was 25 and my partner was 23, and they flew us out and hired us on staff, and we worked there for a season. And that was when we wrote our episode, and we contributed jokes all the way through that season. And then the people who were the head writers of that show at that moment left, and a new head writer came on, and he didn't like our work, and so we lasted there a year, and then we got fired. So as rags to riches to rags, learned some important lessons, but worked for some amazing writers on that show, and obviously those actresses, you'll never see their kind again in terms of people who understand television comedy. I mean, B. Arthur and Betty White and Rue McClanahan and Estelle were all just such professionals, and so had such an amazing kind of connection, not just to the audience, the live audience, but the audience through the camera. And that's a special kind of talent. There aren't that many successful sitcoms like that with that level of talent.
Mm-hmm. So how would you say you've done a little bit of different writing for everything? You've done live in front of a studio comedy with the Golden Girls. You've done animation, and you've done drama for television. What are some of the challenges from writing each of them, and how would you say they differ from each other?
Probably the similarity all the way through is that if you'll read this in lots of writing books, and it's the absolute truth. If people don't care about your characters, they're not going to laugh with you. They're not going to cry with you. They're just not going to stay with you. So the character is super important, and that holds true even in animation. I think that having worked at Family Guy for as long as I have, that there's a mistake that people make, that they think the show is just chaos. It's just jokes being thrown back and forth, and no, Family Guy is successful because there's a way in which people relate to Peter. They relate to Lois. They relate to Meg, Chris, Peter, Stewie, Brian. There are ways in which those characters live, even though they're two-dimensional. They live through the performances of the actors and the drawings by the artists. And so that's a similarity across all disciplines. The difference is, in comedy, it's really important that you have a story that is in and of itself a conflict, and there's an arc to it, but the story itself has to be funny. And that's really difficult because you have to have a story where and this is one of the challenges of writing for all television shows, is that you have to have a story that affects your characters, but not so much so that next week their lives have been completely changed by the previous episode. So that's a really difficult thing. And then the real difficult thing in animation that I don't think people realize is cartoon characters are not actually that interesting to look at. So when you're doing an episode of Family Guy or Simpsons or the animated comedies that are known so well, they're actually packed with much more story than you would have in an episode of Golden Girls, where you could literally have a whole act where they're sitting around the kitchen table. Like that could be like you could have a whole act of just or a whole scene of just them sitting and talking. You can't do that in animation. It's just it'll bore you to tears because when you do it with live actors, you have their facial expressions and their responses to each other. And when you're in animation, you just don't have that. So you really got to pack a lot more story and in a certain way action into an animated show. And then writing in drama, I haven't. Writing in drama is, it's about reality. Like that's, I think that you can sort of push. Obviously, writing for Family Guy, we push to the bounds of reality all the time. Even though we would try to have a story that made sense and connected to the audience, we would have that story, and then we'd go out in all sorts of directions. When you're writing a drama, what I found is you want those people to feel as real as possible. You want their motivations and the way they're talking to feel real. And in comedy, part of the fun of comedy is when somebody surprises you by doing something that's not realistic. The joke I always say about the Gold Girls is that it's completely unrealistic. The sex lives of these 4 old ladies was completely unrealistic. They were getting laid left and right. It just wasn't realistic. But that was fun and it was funny. Whereas if you were doing the dramatic version of that, I just don't think you would do that because it just wouldn't feel real. It would feel like you'd start to question it. Or you'd have to start to dig at who are these old ladies who have to have sex all the time. Like, what is that? Because I don't know about your life, Brandon, but the old ladies I know, they don't seem driven by that. So if you're going to have a bunch of old ladies who are getting laid all the time in a drama, you'd have to figure out some way to explain it and make it part of who their characters are. Do you understand what I'm saying? Is the difference?
Absolutely, yeah.
So and it's show to show. Star Trek, writing for Star Trek Enterprise is obviously very different than writing for Family Guy. But I got hired on a job, and I'm working for Brandon and Rick Berman, and I'd seen the show. So I came out in the second season. I'd seen the show, and I'm like figuring out, okay, what do these guys want? What do they like? What don't they like? What do they need me to do for them? And it took a while to figure it out. I almost got fired a couple times, so off of Enterprise.
So was comedy where you wanted to go? Like you started with Golden Girls, or did you want to start with drama? See, like with me with Warp 5, Enterprise wasn't my favorite, but I've come to love it because I've been talking about it so much. So was comedy where you wanted to go, or did it just kind of end up that way?
No, it's interesting because I wanted to write for television. There was no Star Trek on the air when I broke in. That Star Trek was my love. That's really what I wanted to do, but there was no Star Trek at that point. It was 19. Actually, Star Trek had just come back, 19. So Next Generation had been out for a season. But I had contacts in comedy, and I could do it. Like, I think that what I've learned from my career is that sometimes it's not just important to follow your dream, it's also important to follow your effort. And there's a way in which I can write comedy, which puts me in a really small group of people, like, who can write, and so... And I enjoy it. I've gotten to work with just some amazing people, and I've gotten to write stuff that I'm really proud of, and but I think that, and then I get to now write Star Trek. I write my books, and I've got to write for Star Trek Enterprise, and so there's a way in which I've gotten to do it all, but I went down a certain road because it was sort of my way into the business. And I'm very happy that it went that way because I had some amazing experiences. Mm-hmm. And I learned a lot as a writer.
Mm-hmm. So before we move on to talking about Star Trek, one last question about the animation. How was it different working for Seth MacFarlane versus Matt Groening? And, what was their expectations in writing a script for them? What were some of the differences between the two?
It's interesting. Matt, they're both great guys. And, it's interesting that there's always a lot of people trying to say that there's this kind of rivalry between the shows, and there isn't. Matt and Seth, they're buddies. I mean, they when you see them, they understand their lives better than they understand each other better than probably than anybody else does, because they're both sort of similar. The difference between Matt and Seth is when you're writing with Seth on Family Guy, you're writing with half the cast in the room with you. So there's a way in which you write a joke for Stewie, you pitch a joke for Stewie, and if Seth liked it, he then repeated it in Stewie's voice, and suddenly your mediocre joke is now incredible because it's Seth performing it in the room. And Matt, when I worked with him on Futurama, I mean, he was a great collaborator. And he worked very closely with David Cohen to create the show, and Matt was a big laugher. Getting Matt to laugh was, they're very similar in certain ways. It's like they were both the bosses, both super sweet guys, and both really passionate about their shows. They really weren't, I wouldn't say there's anything that I felt was different, from my perspective as a writer on both their staffs. All I wanted to do was please both of them. And what I liked about both of them is that they were both really generous people. They were all sort of true. They're both true collaborators in the sense of they recognize this show isn't just mine, although I'll protect it to my death, but I get it done by working with this group of people who I respect, and that was both of their attitudes on both of those shows.
So writing where no fan has gone before must have been like a dream come true for you at that time.
It was crazy. I joined the staff at Futurama. It was the 4th season, and they were talking about doing an episode with Shatner and Nimoy, but the story they had floating around was a giant Shatner and a giant Nimoy have a fight over New York City, like Godzilla, basically. But there were these giant. I'm sure that's the only part of the idea that I heard. And then I joined the staff, and David Cohen said we were thinking of that idea or more of a Star Trek kind of takeoff. And they had done a lot of Star Trek references up to that point, so I think they weren't sure they wanted to do that. But then we started talking about it, and David decided, let's do the more, something that's real, like a real Star Trek homage. And that was a staff full of Star Trek fans, like top to bottom. Everybody was in one way or another a Star Trek fan. And yet I'd been there a week and a half, and David Cohen said, no, I think Goodman's got to write it. Like, I was the biggest Star Trek fan. Like, they just met me, and it was clear that I was a bigger Star Trek fan than everybody. There was a certain order in scripts of who would get the next script, and I cut the line because David said, no, you have to write this one. So, that was, and then literally I had 2 weeks to write my draft. The first week I was on jury duty. So I would go to jury duty and I would go home and write in the night. And then finally jury duty ended, and then I sprained my ankle. So then I was on crutches and I had to write the script. And even with those two annoying things, it was 2 of the best weeks of my writing career to get to write that script.
Yeah, it's a pretty awesome script. It's really well done. I mean, there's a lot of great jokes in it. She is awesome.
Again, I don't want to take full credit for it. The writing staff, Futurama, contributed a lot of jokes to it. It was a super fun thing to work on. I do remember, like, we were having trouble breaking it, figuring out who was going to kidnap the original cast, and I said, oh, and we couldn't. And David Cohen was like, I can't quite figure this out. I can't quite figure out, like, who this super fan is going to be. And then I said, what if it's an energy being? And he laughed and he said, that's it. And that gave so many levels to the parody to have Melvar as the super fan.
So what aspect of your career do you think prepared you the most for working on Star Trek Enterprise?
I wasn't prepared. I mean, I think I wasn't prepared in terms of my career. I mean, I'd worked on a lot of shows. By that time, I think I'd worked on 10 or 11 shows at least before I got hired on Enterprise. And what you learn when you get hired on a staff of a television show is that your job is to help the head writer, showrunner do his or her job. And that's not, that's what you think is a good idea isn't always what they think is a good idea. And so you have to sort of understand them, and you're there to help. You're there to help them do their work. So joining the staff of Enterprise, I mean, the thing that prepared me the most, that got me the job on Enterprise, was I'd been reading interviews with Brandon for 10 years, ever since he'd been, he'd show up in sci-fi magazines, and I would read the interviews with Brandon. And I go into the job interview, and I'm just parroting back to him things he said in his interviews, but he didn't know that I was just doing that. I would say, the thing about Star Trek is that you could write it. It's a mystery one week, and it's a Western the next week. And I'm literally word for word things he said in an interview. So that's how I always feel. And I joke with him now that that's how I got the job. But he really, I think, connected to me in that. And they also wanted to add humor to the show, and I think that they thought hiring a comedy writer might be a good idea. I don't think I added any humor to Enterprise, so it was about, the thing about going to work at Star Trek, and this was kind of an Enterprise, was even though the show was only in its second season, these guys had been doing it for so long, and they had a shorthand, and they had, and figuring out how you work in this environment was really tough, and I eventually did. But it was tough. It was tough. I was there second and third year. At the end of the second season, it was questionable whether they were going to pick up my option. And a couple of the guys on the staff played a role. John Scheiben and Chris Black played a role in talking to Brandon. I think Brandon liked me, but he wasn't sure he should bring me back. I'd had one terrible episode and one good episode. And they said, no, Goodman's good, because they had worked in small rooms with me, and that made a big difference in terms of my getting a second chance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you mentioned there, and you've talked about it online, and I've seen a few interviews. So you've got what's heralded as one of the worst episodes of the series, and you've also got one that I don't know if you realize is heralded as one of the best, with North Star. Like, that's a huge fan favorite episode.
Is it? It's funny. I'm glad to hear it. I feel like I haven't seen enough people saying they like it. I haven't seen people that say they hate it. I think, Precious Cargo, the joke I always make is the piece of they aired is not the piece of I wrote. So that my script was terrible, and then it was rewritten and made different terrible. And that was a bad start for me. And again, I was sort of learning my way, and television's not about learning your way. You've got to be ready to do the job. And so that was sort of my fault, I think. I wasn't quite ready to write a script yet. I jumped in. I said, I'll do it. And I shouldn't have taken a little more time to figure out how things work there. And there were a lot of problems with that script and that episode, which is, which honestly I've never seen. I can't bring myself to watch it.
Yeah, we just recently watched it. The last episode of this that aired, we tried to do a comparison between The Perfect Mate and Precious Cargo, and we ended up talking quite a bit more about Perfect Mate, and then we really went off on a tangent and started talking about the hashtag Me Too and sexual assault in the media that's going on right now. So it ended up being a very interesting discussion, anyways.
That is interesting.
But we just recently watched the two of them. Now, when you were writing it, were you writing it knowing that this was the same alien species? Like, was that something you brought to the script?
No, I didn't. No, I think that was added later, actually. But no, I didn't. And I didn't even make the connection when I was writing it. I mean, it wasn't my story. Rick and Brandon come up with the story, and I think there are touches in there that I'm still proud of, but again, I haven't seen them. But that whole thing where T'Pol and Archer con the guys into thinking that they're being put on trial. I thought that was a fun thing to do, and that was something. Chris Black actually wrote that scene, but he and I worked it out. It was based on actually a scene in the book Clear and Present Danger.
Okay.
And both of us had read that book, and we were like, you remember that scene where let's do a version of that, where these Coast Guard guys convince these drug dealers that they can put them on trial, and it's interesting where you get your inspiration from. But no, I didn't set out to make that connection to Perfect Mate.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the episodes that's really loved of yours, and I'll fully admit here that I'm not a fan of the episode myself, but is Judgment.
Oh, good.
So,
why aren't you a fan?
I don't like how similar it is to Star Trek 6, and that it upsets me. But I know that it's a very popular episode of what people.
Now hold on a second. Now hold on. In what way is it similar? Let's have the conversation, Brandon. No, and you're obviously entitled to your opinion, but I've read this online before. In what way is it similar to Star Trek 6 besides Klingon Trial and Repente?
But that's the majority of the episode.
but it's not about the same thing at all.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, we're using. I think what I like. I can't dismiss that. But we're sort of saying, okay, well, this is how the Klingons conduct a trial. We have our Rashomon element.
Yes.
We also have, we're also showing something which is different than Star Trek 6, which is, and it's sort of important to remember this, that at this point in Star Trek Enterprise, the Klingons had not become the bad guys yet. Mm-hmm. They'd been there and they caused trouble. We're having trouble with them. Judgment. Two things about that I was trying to do with that script was, okay, we're not going to be able to stay peace with these guys because these guys oppress people, and that's not who we are. We help people. And that to me was like, this is going to be the beginning of what from a continuity point of view of what was going to be the problems between the Federation and the Klingons. It's like, these people come, we're going to help them, and even though it's going to get us in trouble with the Klingons, but we have to. They're suffering, and this is terrible, and they oppress them. And so to me, the messages of and then the messages of, the other thing that J.G. Hertzler's character is going through is we're learning something about the Klingons, which is, you can't have a whole race of warriors. Mm-hmm. You got to have teachers. You got to have scientists. You've got to have, he talks about his parents, and he talks about, and I'm sort of talking about things in there about the militarization of a society. And to me, yes, I'm using the set pieces from Star Trek 6, but I'm talking about a lot of other stuff. I didn't steal anything from Star Trek 6 except Klingon, how they do a Klingon trial, and they send their prisoners to Repente. Mm-hmm. But that to me is that's continuity. That's not stealing.
Sure, yeah.
Because I'm telling a completely different story.
I will say, to be fair, it's not just Judgment. Like, by the time I got to Enterprise, and even still after rewatching it a few times, I'm very tired with the Klingons myself in general. And
I can't argue with that. So.
Yeah, like Sleeping Dogs from season 1, like, to me is brutal, and the use again of bringing back the now I'm the bad Star Trek fan. The Klingon family from Next Generation, the Duras family.
Oh yeah, well I'm sorry, that's me doing continuity points. So I apologize.
And I'm glad that they ended it at the end of the season with the Expanse that plot line. But for me, I was just very, very tired of the Klingons at that point, and that probably contributes to my lack of enjoyment of the episode. But
now the Klingon who plays Duras in that episode, do you know who that is?
I don't.
All right, well, that's an actor named Dan Reardon, and he starred in a TV movie that I co-wrote called The Adventures of Captain Zoom in Outer Space.
Okay.
And this was a TV movie that was essentially a pilot for a show that didn't go. That was basically Galaxy Quest, although we wrote it 2 or 3 years before Galaxy Quest, of an actor who plays like a science fiction hero in a 50s show, gets transported to another planet who think he's real.
Mm-hmm.
And Dan's a friend of mine, and so I cast him as Klingon. But you should check out The Adventures of Captain Zoom in Outer Space. I think you can see some of it online
Okay.
on YouTube. Yeah.
The biggest compliment that people do have about Judgment is that they like seeing Klingons that are not warriors and seeing them having a job, and that's the biggest thing that people really like about that episode for sure.
I thought that was new. It's like we never, you can't have everybody can't be a soldier. You gotta have, if the Klingons have there's got to be people who are like accountants. They got to be Klingon accountants somewhere. I mean, like, so that was part of the inspiration of that episode.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's jump to North Star here because, that is, ever since I've been on the show, that's an episode that really has come up as on a lot of people's lists of top 10 episodes for
That's
Enterprise.
Nice.
Yeah,
Wow.
and I heard a story where you talked about how you pitched it and how it was the first one that was brought to the table for season 3 that didn't have as much to do with the Xindi arc.
Yeah. Well, Rick said to Brandon as Brandon sat with the writers most of the time, and Rick's sort of marching orders for season 3 were, look, we could do that. We'll do this continuing story. It's cool that he had worked out with Brandon and the Xindi and whatever. But he said, but we should have a couple of standalone episodes in the pipeline just in case we get halfway through the Xindi thing and it's just not working. So that was, that was just Rick being cautious in a good way. You're a TV producer and you sort of say, okay, we're going to do this arc, and then you think you get to episode 4 of the arc and it's bad, and you're like, we should just abandon this. That isn't what happened. But so Brandon said, pitch standalone stories, and he gave the freedom to say, you can use original series kinds of ideas. So I pitched him a wagon train was kidnapped, and taken prisoner, by these aliens, the Skagaran, and we find this planet now, and the humans have revolted and taken over the planet. And Rick heard it from Brandon and said, "Done, go, perfect." And that, so I got to write. We worked out North Star, we worked out the story. And I wrote that script, and it was a great experience. I mean, the director David, what's his last name? I forgot. Did an amazing job.
David Strayton.
David Strayton. A very talented director, added just this level of a visual level to it that made it seem like you were. It was in a Western town, but it had an alien feel to it. And in my mind, I was picturing the Big Valley, and, he made it look like Unforgiven. So I thought, like, he just did an amazing job. And Scott is great in the episode. And they coordinated that incredible fight scene at the end. And then you see something which you don't really see in a lot of episodes, which is, and maybe none of the episodes up to that point, you see that shuttle fly over that Western town, and it's like something you don't see. You don't see our shuttles interacting with real buildings. Mm-hmm. And I know it's a little thing, but I love that. I felt like, this is something really new. But it really was inspired by original series, alternate Earth episodes. The Roman episode, the Planet of Nazi episode. All those. Bread Circus's Pattern Force, all those which were done back then to save money by reusing costumes and sets and locations, but which we didn't really have to do, but we had a story that was fun.
Well, yeah, that's a staple of Star Trek, and when we covered it, because we're in the middle of, we're almost done now, but we're basically in the middle of our season 3 retrospective, and we're taking them 4 episodes at a time and going into the dive, and we said that when we were talking about. North Star, we're like, yeah, this is very TOS, and it fits right in with that Planet of the Week feel that it had. That was such a staple of that show.
It's interesting too that separates original series from the more current incarnations is that, and my two episodes, Judgment and North Star, are like this in the sense that they're really following the arc of an outside character. So it's it's the sheriff in North Star and how he changes. It's really his story in a lot of ways, and then in Judgment, it's really J.G. Hertzler's character's story. Our characters are there as catalysts to change the lives of these people, and that is very much original series. If you look back, that was really what those episodes were. It ended up being more of the show. Star Trek, in a certain way, even though we had our continuing characters, it was in some ways an anthology series too. Like you would have just visit a world, and how does interacting with the Enterprise characters change the lives of these people.
Mm-hmm. And now I might be confusing on my titles here, but I know that in the novels that are coming out now, there are Skagarans that are like referenced. I think there's some by David Mack in the Next Generation timeline as well.
Good.
Like, so like that's a character race that's stuck around.
I threw that's nice to hear. Wow, I threw a little North Star reference in my most recent book.
Yes.
Just yeah.
Yes, in the Jean-Luc Picard book. Yes.
Yeah.
So now the last one that we want to talk about here is The Forgotten, which is a very important episode for Trip.
Yes.
A very beautiful episode. So tell us a little bit about the inspiration for writing this episode.
Well, I co-wrote it with Chris Black, who's a good friend of mine, and he was on the staff, and we were really dealing with like bringing back that idea that how Trip's sister's death would affect him, and also dealing with the death of crewmen aboard Enterprise. And so it was really about like let's bring this back. And I think it was on. I think honestly it was Brandon who said let's address this. We had this whole thing happen at the beginning of the season with Florida getting destroyed, and then and that Trip's sister, and they hadn't really been addressing it. It was like, okay, let's really wrestle with it. So I worked on the story with Chris, and we split up the script, and it was also about there was another piece of the story is Archer trying to prove to the Xindi sloth Xindi that the insectoid Xindi, or that the lizards Xindi were time traveling. That was so that but it was I think, I'll be honest, I think that Chris Black probably did most of the heavy lifting in terms of the emotional Trip stuff, and Chris is on the drama side a much more experienced writer than I was at the time, and just did a great job with it. We also have in that episode the first crossover with Family Guy, because that's the episode that Seth guest starred as.
Yeah.
Later to be named Ensign Rivers. He wasn't named Ensign Rivers in that episode.
Yeah, he was in 2 episodes.
Yeah.
It's funny, the first time I saw it, I'm like, it was on when I did my first rewatch, and I'm like, wait a minute.
Yeah. Well, I had worked at Family Guy before Enterprise, and it had gotten canceled, so I was still friendly with Seth, and Seth was a big Star Trek fan. Rick Berman was a big Family Guy fan, so I said, hey, maybe we can give Seth a part, and so we gave him a part, and then he became good friends with Brandon when he came to work on the show, and that has now led to their relationship, which produced Cosmos, and and obviously the Orville.
Mm-hmm. Right on. Well, before we get to the Orville, let's talk a little bit about your books that you've written here. So you've got 3 books, right?
Yes.
So there's the Federation 150 Years, and then the 2 autobiography books.
Right.
So how was it managing 50 years of canon and coming up with this idea for Federation the first 150 years?
Well, the book was not my idea.
Okay.
The book was the idea of a guy named John Van Sitters at CBS Consumer Products, who had seen these books that were, what was it? I think it was the John Adams biography or whatever. There was a John Adams biography, I think, and then they did a book which had like letters and documents in it, like reproductions. His idea was like, why don't we do a version of that for Federation? And Dave Rossi, who was a friend of John's and was a producer on Enterprise, and was working at Paramount. John was looking, let's see, who can get to write this thing? And I want to get a TV writer because I want things written in different voices. And Dave said, well, why don't we try David Goodman? And which was the greatest thing ever. I mean, I had never written a book, and I kept, honestly, every way through the process, I kept saying to John, I've never written a book before. You know that, right? Because I was really scared by the process. It's a very different writing process, writing like that. But once they signed me to do it, and it was a real puzzle. What I say with all three of these books is that you've got all these like pieces of a puzzle, and these pieces, and you don't have the full picture, but you've got pieces of the full picture, and then you've got huge blank spots, and then my job with these books is to fill in the blank spots so that the pictures that you're already aware of in the puzzle make sense as part of this larger tapestry. Mm-hmm. And there were, I think that the reason I was excited, there's always something I'm really excited to do with each of the books to fill in. So for the Federation book, the Romulan War was something that like we had no details of it, none. And a couple little mentions here and there, but almost no details. And I knew I was going to get to really flesh that out and make it make sense and make it. And I'm a military history buff, so there were a lot of references to all sorts of things: Pearl Harbor, League of Nations, like all these things that inspired things in the book. But that was probably my biggest excitement, was that I was going to get to write that chapter, which I'm still very proud of. Mm-hmm. But that was the tough book. The hardest part of the book, honestly, was the Enterprise chapter, because there was no room to make stuff up, because Enterprise really happened very chronologically. There's very few empty spots in there, and I had to make that interesting, but also not deviate from what people knew, but also I didn't want it to read like a Wikipedia entry. So. Mm-hmm.
Right on. But you were able to add some really interesting Enterprise elements. Now, I don't remember if there was any in the autobiography of James Kirk, because it's been a few years since I've read that, and I hadn't done a rewatch yet in a while. But there was definitely quite a few in the Jean-Luc Picard book that you recently wrote.
Well, there's Enterprise stuff in the Kirk book too. He's on it's little things. I think I don't say it explicitly, but I think Malcolm Reed is the Commandant of Starfleet Academy when Kirk is there. I think they're on Kirk's trip that he takes to Tarsus 4 as a kid. The name of the captain is Mayweather. Okay. So there's all these little things that I never say explicitly it's them, but I definitely made sure that that we had, for an Enterprise fan, if you're reading these books, there's stuff in there, and obviously. And in Federation, I definitely filled in stuff like what happens to Archer after the Enterprise, and the hardest thing to figure out in that book was making two pieces of what seemed to be conflicting references to the first meetings with the Klingons make sense. Mm-hmm. So in Picard's, in First Contact, Picard says the reason we proceed this way in meeting a new culture has to do with this disastrous first meeting with the Klingons. Mm-hmm. And then we see the first meeting with the Klingons in Enterprise. We see it. So what was disastrous about that? It didn't seem disastrous. But if you read my Federation book, I actually show you why it was. Mm-hmm. And why it led to all the conflict that would plague Federation. So there was those kinds of issues too. And then there were fun things in the Federation book, like there's a reference to the Battle of Sharon in Next Generation, which people attribute to the Romulan War. And then is that the same Sharon that is in Let That Be Your Last Battlefield? And if it is, what's that connection? And I find this connection that I'm just so like proud of, because if you remember, and Let That Be Your Last Battlefield, Beale's ship is invisible. So I came up with this whole thing that the Romulans were buying their cloaking technology from the people of Charon, and that was that, and they were buying ships, and that was, I was just really proud of that connection. That was just, serendipitous, because in Let That Be Your Last Battlefield, they didn't want to build a new model, so they said, "Oh, his ship's invisible," but I found a way to make it connect to the Romulans.
Excellent. Yeah, so I haven't read the Federation 150, but I've read both the Kirk and the Jean-Luc Picard autobiographies. And what I really appreciated about those books were you didn't just tell the stories. Like there was a couple of stories that I really wanted to know from each of those characters,
right.
But you also came up with some new ones as well. Like without getting too heavily into spoilers, there's the story in the James T. Kirk autobiography of the Star Trek V story, which was just brilliant. I absolutely loved it. And there was the really interesting story when Picard and Data take that undercover mission, which I don't want to give away, because if I say who it is or whatnot, I think it'll be a spoiler. But it was really nice to have these extra stories in there, as well as the ones that we were wanting to read.
Well, thank you. Well, the Star Trek V story, again, without giving it away, I mean, reflected how I felt about that film, and I really, like, I don't want to have to. I felt like I wanted to explain it in a way that makes it part of the story, but isn't. And then the Data Picard thing, to me, made sense because it takes place before they're serving together on the Enterprise. And, I could do the whole undercover mission to Romulus again in my book, but everyone's seen it. Anybody reading my book has probably seen that 2-part unification episode, and even if they haven't, they should go watch it. I can't do it better. And I wanted to say, it's so quick that the admirals say, "You guys are going on an undercover mission." I wanted this idea of, like, the reason they chose them was because they'd done something similar before. Not in any way exactly the same, but they'd done something successfully before. And I obviously found a way to tie it into some other mystery. You don't want to spoil it, but some other, what I consider a mystery, a canon mystery. And it was a great way to bring back a character who I love. So.
My favorite character.
Yeah, he's terrific. Well, it's also that character, just, John Billingsley is such a great actor. We're talking about Phlox, obviously, but but I feel like your listeners would know who your favorite character is. So
yes, I've already mentioned once or twice, so minor spoiler. But also with the Jean-Luc Picard autobiography, I mean, I love that you acknowledged all canon, because at the end you're making references to the Kelvin timeline and the 2009 film.
It's really interesting. I have to be careful about that, because I did that in the Kirk book too, and then somebody put it up on the Amazon page, and I got all this negative, these negative reviews from people who hadn't even read the book, but just read the spoiler that I reference, the Kelvin timeline a little bit. But to me, Leonard Nimoy is in JJ's movie. It's canon. Yeah. Sorry. It's too bad. Leonard Nimoy is Spock, and he's in JJ's first movie. I'm sorry, it's canon. There are a lot of fans who just don't want to say that that's canon, and it's like, I think if Leonard's in it and it's got Star Trek on it, that's and I love that first movie. I think the origin of Kirk's birth, and then Spock on Vulcan, and as a kid, and I don't know, so much great stuff in that movie. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah. Now, we were talking on Twitter. We were going a little bit back and forth, and I'm gonna say what I said to you there, in that you had mentioned that some people were wondering, like, not everything you've written follows in line canonically with the novels that have been written.
Right.
And how does somebody like me who reads the novels work with that. And I responded to you, I'm not going to let something as stupid as canon prevent me from enjoying a good story.
Well, thank you. That's very nice. I think
You know?
I think I've gotten my own. I have now with these 3 books and now my next book, I've got my own novel verse,
Right.
and they are all internally consistent. So if you read my books, you're gonna
Yes.
there's consistency all across all of them, and so to me, I would understand the frustration of somebody who had read, reading the other novels and that where they establish, I guess, Picard has a son, which is not part of my book. I can understand that frustration if you like that piece of the story, but it doesn't serve my story to pay attention to that canon. So.
Well, Michael Jan Friedman's Stargazer novels, he wrote the origin story for when Guinan and Picard met. And yours is very different from that. But you know what? I liked yours better, right? Your Guinan storyline, like, it's really, really good, and it's a really kind of creative and interesting way, right?
I didn't read those. I'm a fan of Michael Jan Friedman's books. I loved Crossover. Yeah, well, the guy is... What's that?
He wrote 6 Stargazer books under the Stargazer name.
I'll have to check them out. But to me, I had different priorities in this book because I had to make it. The meeting of Guinan, serves a lot of different purposes in this story, and so in my story, and so for me to have to adhere to somebody else's version of it, I wasn't sure. I was aware of those books. I didn't know what Michael had done, but Picard meeting Guinan and the sort of the jokes that I write and all that stuff that are part of that story, to me are necessary parts of my book. And I don't know that if I was adhering to somebody else's idea of canon, I would be able to carry it out the way I needed to.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing that I messaged you about it was, if somebody has a problem with that, then the easy way to explain something like that is in the book itself. Picard makes reference that he's going to the Archer building on Starfleet campus, which is all about Jonathan Archer. Right. And then you've got your editor note at the bottom that says, actually, it's his dad, the Archer. Right. That's a common thing. And it's like when you're writing an autobiography, people's memories differ, right? And they change over time, and people's perspectives change.
I think that's a good way to look at it too. There's I don't know if you notice, I have that same.
Yes.
Captain Kirk makes the same mistake when he goes to and that was just a way to do, I could have just said Archer building and left it, but I wanted to bring up, a little bit of Enterprise history about Henry Archer and whatever.
Yeah. Right on. Well, before we move on to the Orville, I just want to thank you for those 2 books. I loved them.
Thank you.
They were absolutely amazing. I can't wait for the next one. I know you're working on another one. It's not the character I wish it was, but I'm still eagerly looking forward to it. I think that the next one should be Archer myself. I think this format would be wonderful for Archer. But it's Spock for the next one, isn't it?
It is Spock. And I think, it's interesting. I feel that it really is interesting. And I obviously write these books for Star Trek fans, but the Kirk book, a lot of people who are not diehard Star Trek fans read it, and I'm not getting that same play with the Picard book. Okay. And I think in writing the Spock book, that it's such a sort of iconic character that I'm sort of hoping to find those readers who I can sort of bring in. But again, I start by writing a book for Star Trek fans, so that whether anybody else reads it or not, and I don't know that Archer is enough of a well-known character that people beyond Star Trek fans would read it. But thank you. I guess if I keep doing them, I guess I don't know who I would do next. I also like sort of stopping with trilogy because Spock crosses over with both Picard and Kirk, and there are going to be scenes in each of the books, in the Kirk book and the Picard book, that will then be replayed slightly differently in the Spock book, where you get to see them from Spock's point of view. So obviously, Spock meeting Kirk and McCoy for the first time is one example, or the mind meld with Picard, or that happens in all these things that I think are fun way to sort of tie all three books together and give somebody who's read all three these sort of prizes when they read the third one.
Mm-hmm. Well, bravo, David. The books are outstanding, and I look forward to the Spock one so much.
Thank you so much.
So on to the Orville right now. So that's the big thing in your career right now that's going on. So
sure.
The one thing I want to ask first off is, how do you feel about the fans? And I'm frustrated when people are like, oh, this is true Star Trek, and this is not, Discovery's not Star Trek, Orville's Star Trek, and like all this nonsense that's going on. As a creator of the show, how do you feel when you see those things and hear those things?
Well, it's been it goes back since the beginning of time, as Star Trek fans yelling about the new Star Trek series. I mean, it's just not. It's just a given. I don't think we're competitive with Discovery because we're not on at the same time. Like, I think, I've said this numerous times. I think I'm excited that there are these two shows that take place on a spaceship. I got two things to watch. I think Discovery's great. I think they're doing a really interesting new kind of Star Trek, and they're, and like every Star Trek, there are hits and misses in it, but it's very well done. A great cast, and it looks terrific. And they're doing something new, which I like. Good, something new. A new way of telling stories that shows the flexibility of Star Trek. Fans, they say they're fans. They say they're upset about it, but they're still watching both. There's this one guy on one of the websites every week when we have a new episode of Orville. He goes on a rant about it, and I read it every week, and I'm like. And I never comment. I never post on this thing because I think he'd just get mad at me. But I'm like, he's watching it beginning to end. I got no complaints. He wants to rant about it. Great. It means he got to the end. That's the and so to me, I think fans like to own their Star Trek. They like to own it. They want this to be mine. And so when somebody does it in some way that's not theirs, they want to feel like that they want to be heard about it. And honestly too, though, you read criticisms from fans, and sometimes they're right on. Sometimes a fan criticism of your work is absolutely dead on. Like, it's like, you know what, they're right. And that's one of the great and terrible things about the internet.
Mm-hmm. No, I watched the first, I think it was 5 episodes, and then I also host The Edge, which is our Discovery podcast, and so I had to start watching Discovery 4 times a week in order to prepare myself for that, so I didn't have much time for much else. But out of the first 5 that I watched, I didn't get to your episode, but there's some really good stuff in there. It took a couple episodes for me to get into it and get kind of what was happening, because it looks so much like Star Trek, but yet it's different. But... Right. Take this, I hope this is the compliment that it's intended to be, but the episode where Bortus is on trial for his child is like, that would be top 10 Star Trek if that was a Star Trek episode.
Yeah, that was a great episode. I mean, Seth wrote that one, and we all worked on it together, but I mean, it really was Seth, and then Brandon directed it, and you're really dealing with like issues there that are really current issues about sexuality and parenting, and through the lens of sci-fi, which really is this Star Trek way of telling a story. So, but updated, modern, really, and with a sense of humor, which is really important on our show. So.
Mm-hmm. Now, the episode you wrote is called Old Wounds. Is that correct?
No, I wrote Krill.
Okay. So
that's episode 6. Yeah.
Episode 6 is yours. Okay, so when you were writing that, tell us a little bit about, because I don't know as much about the Orville, so I don't want to. This question's not coming up right. So the way that I want to word it.
Don't worry. Sorry.
So when you're writing an episode of the Orville, how conscious are you that you're making like a kind of a comedic version of Star Trek?
Well, you're not. I mean, Orville is its own thing. I mean,
Mhm.
it's not. I know it looks like Star Trek, and I know, but you're not thinking, "Oh, I'm writing Star Trek." You're writing a show. So when we're working on stories, I mean, three of the people in the room worked on Star Trek. So you have Brandon in the room and Andre Bormanis and me when we were breaking these stories. So and then Seth's the big Star Trek fan, so you're talking about it, but then it's about Orville. It's about our characters. So there's a way in which it's like you're not writing Star Trek, you're writing Orville. You're writing what's going on with these characters and how our characters react and act and react with each other and to aliens is completely Orville. It's not Star Trek, and so that to me is you're writing a story. You want to make sure that your characters sound like Orville. They sound like our people, and our characters are I think in many ways much more flawed than Star Trek characters are. They're much more. They're not the hottest crew in the galaxy. They're competent and they succeed, but they get annoyed. They get pissed off at each other. They get you've got that relationship at the center between Ed and Kelly, husband and ex-husband and wife. You've got the friendship with Ed and Gordon, the friendship between Gordon and John, the relationship between the Doctor and Alara, and these are all unique characters to our show, and so how they move through a story is very different than a Star Trek episode.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now you've got a lot of talented and amazing actors that are coming in. The last episode that I watched, they were on a ship that was kind of like a not a western town, but they go to the ship and it's like a long distance ship that's it's been a few months since I watched it. It was going from one star to another.
Our bioship episode.
Yeah, the bioship. And James Morrison, who I know from Space Above and Beyond, was on it. And it's like, that's an underused actor in my opinion. That guy's great. But you've had, Robert Picardo's been on there. You got a lot of Trek alum that have been as guest stars. You've had what's her name she played in the movie Monster. She was the star of Monster. Charlize Theron.
Yeah.
Like, you're getting some really amazing people on this production.
Well, part of that, I mean, most of that's due to Seth. I mean, Seth has made movies, and he's a pretty big guy in this business, and so Liam Neeson guest starred in an episode, and
yes.
and Liam and Charlize were in a movie that Seth directed, A Million Ways to Die in the West, and they loved working with Seth, and Seth called them and say, "Hey, could you do this?" And they were both like, "Let's go." That's a function of people who've worked with Seth really wanting to work with him again, and I think they were both, they both love the parts, and and Picardo, we're all fans of Picardo, and that he and we had Jeffrey Tambor and Holland Taylor play Ed's parents in an episode, and it was fun to have those two, and but I think Seth's an attraction for people to work with. He's somebody people really respect and admire.
Mm-hmm. The first interview that I got to do for Trek FM was on my podcast Melodic Treks, which is all about the music, and I got to talk with Ron Jones for my very first interview. So I was like, it was pretty awesome to talk with him because he did a lot of work on Family Guy.
No, Ron is a super talented guy. Well, Ron does music for Family Guy. Well,
yes.
He used to. A very super talented composer.
Yeah, for sure. Now, one of the listener questions that we have, so Norman Lau says, have you started to write any episodes for Season 2 of the Orville, and what would you like to see happen in Season 2?
Well, we actually already have a few episodes written. We're going to learn a little bit more about the Klingon, Isaac race, artificial intelligence. I think that's going to be an interesting thing for fans. We're gonna a couple of great Bortus episodes in the works. We got and we're gonna another great Alara episode. We're starting to talk about. So we've just started. We had a couple of scripts left over, which why I know we have the Klingon episode and the but so to me that I like as I do in my books, I like exploring the world. Seth has created this sort of framework galaxy, and I'm hoping that we can sort of start to fill in some of the history of our Orville universe, and how did we get to where we are, and I always love that kind of stuff. So.
Mm-hmm. Now, Joe Saltzman asks, how much did the final version of North Star vary from the original idea, and if there were any major changes, can you elaborate on the differences?
No, there really weren't. I mean, it was pretty close to my original pitch. I think the big change was I don't think I had. I'm now forgetting the names of the characters, but there was the sheriff and the deputy,
mm-hmm.
and I don't think I had the deputy. I think I just had. No, that's not true because No, that's not true. I definitely have the deputy. I think I might not have had the good sheriff. The two characters and that relationship was something that was added a little bit later. But for the most part, it's the episode is pretty close to the idea. I think the only thing that I wanted to do, which just was too expensive, was I wanted to open the show showing the wagon train being abducted.
Okay.
So start back and I don't think anybody's made this connection, but in the bar, the bartender points to one of the founders of the colony, Cooper Smith, and Cooper Smith is the name of one of the main characters of the television show Wagon Train.
Okay.
So, which was one of Roddenberry's inspirations for Star Trek, Wagon Train to the Stars.
Right.
Wagon Train was a very successful Western show, was on for a very long time, and I named some characters after, and then we changed the names, but nothing interesting, no interesting changes.
Okay. Now, Jay Scardina says Judgment is one of my favorite Enterprise episodes. Whose idea was it to make Archer's Klingon lawyer stay behind?
Oh, that was mine. I mean, it was my idea. Was that that having the lawyer, like what I was doing with that was I was planting the seeds for what would be the post Next Generation Klingons, which were Klingons that were the Next Generation Klingons that were about honor, and that because the Klingons we see in original series are not particularly honorable. Right. They're really kind of the bad guys, and sort of what I'm saying in Judgment is look at where the Klingons are headed. They're headed to what we know to be the original series Klingons, but Kolos. Is that his name, Kolos? I'm not forgetting his name. But J.G. Hertz's character is he's remembering what it means to be honorable. It means and he's the beginning of the seeds of what would be the next generation Klingons. And you see him sort of chipping away at ice at the end of that. And that's sort of a metaphor for I'm going to keep chipping away at this until we change our culture.
Nice. Right on. Well, what are some projects that you're working on right now other than the Orville that some of the listeners can watch out for?
Well, I mean, the autobiography of Mr. Spock, which is going to come out next fall, that's something I'm doing right now. But Orville pretty much takes up full time. It's we're in the room every day working on these scripts. We've got, we're going to start shooting in the spring, so we got to get those scripts done, and it's a lot of work, but we're having a great time. So
good. Yeah. And is there any aspects of your career that we haven't touched on? Because there's a lot of other shows that you've worked on. Is there any other stories you'd like to share that are particularly special to you?
Well, the one of the losses of my career is that the Adventures of Captain Zoom in Outer Space, which I mentioned earlier, and I think somebody posted it online, and it's a fun little movie. Ron Perlman. For Beauty and the Beast and Sons of Anarchy is in it. And Nichelle Nichols is in it. I got to work with Nichelle on that. Dan Reardon, Liz Vassy, who is a very well-known actress from CSI, other things. So anyway, it was a fun little movie that we did, and I think people who listen to your podcast might really enjoy it. No, I'm very fortunate. I've worked now for close to 30 years as a writer, and it's got to do so many fun different things. And I did a Lego Batman movie years ago, which was off of the video game, which you can see, which I'm also very proud of. But to get to do all this kind of stuff is obviously, I'm very lucky to have had the career that I've had.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Where can people find you on social media if they want to follow you or interact with you?
I'm on Twitter at David A. Goodman on Twitter. I tweet mostly jokes, and a lot of them are anti-Trump jokes. So if you're politically not in that realm, I wouldn't follow me. I think you'll just get annoyed. That's mostly that's the only social media I'm on.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, David. It's been a real privilege to speak with you. It's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much.
Brandon, thank you so much for reaching out. I had a great time.
It's been fun talking with David A. Goodman today about his career, but it's not the only thing we've been discussing here on the network. So take a quick listen to some of the other things you may have missed elsewhere on Trek FM.
Previously on Trek.fm, The Edge, a Star Trek Discovery podcast.
I think they do that really good with another, if you want to call it Easter egg, which is when Michael does commit her act of mutiny, she does it with a Vulcan neck pinch. And that's, right in the tradition of Spock, right? Spock does that in the Menagerie. When he commits his act of mutiny, he does that to a fellow Starfleet officer.
Warp 5.
I think it's a lot more than that, and this character is an incredibly in-depth character, and there's a lot more to her than this. And I think that the reason that the evidence for this is because of how she reacts with Picard. And even Picard, Picard has this opinion of her.
The Orb.
And so I feel as though O'Brien really is one of the characters who kind of opens up this idea for Rom that there's a different type of life. And I honestly think O'Brien is kind of the character that Rom probably looks the most up to on the station.
Yeah, I think so.
And would want to be, if there's somebody that Rom's like, oh, I wish I could be like somebody when I grow up, it would be O'Brien.
Standard Orbit.
All these different languages and so forth, and it just instantly translates based on what has already been figured out between, two beings or whatever. This is different. The translator does not work that way. And I thought that is really sci-fi, right? Universal concepts coming through brainwaves in order to translate into language. That's pretty neat.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
So check out all these shows and join the conversation about your favorite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, please be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad, or Apple TV, or on the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they're published. And please leave us a star rating and a written review. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, in most third-party apps, and you can stream and download the MP3 from our website or grab the RSS link as well. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there are many ways for you to do that. The best place to join in the larger conversation is the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type Babel, that's B-A-B-E-L, into the search field on Facebook, and it should come right up. If you'd like to send us email, you can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact. You could choose Send to a Show and select Warp 5. That will come right to Floyd and myself. You can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. The best place to find Floyd is in the Babel Conference. You can find me there, but you can also find me on Twitter at Brandon-Shea. You can find me here on the network with The Edge, which is our Star Trek Discovery podcast. And you can find me over on the Fandom Podcast Network with my friends Chris and Tom, where we have a podcast called Good Evening, an Alfred Hitchcock podcast. And we go through Alfred Hitchcock's movies one at a time, all the way from the beginning. And coming out very soon is our episode on the silent film The Farmer's Wife. If you'd like to keep all of our shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/TrekFM. That's Patreon.com/TrekFM to get all the details. Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more. Available through our special patrons website, Patron Zone. It requires a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month, and we really appreciate any support you can give us, and we hope you'll join the team. Again, you'll find all the details at patreon.com/trekfm. And at this time, we'd like to thank the associate producers of Warp 5 for all of their support by supporting the show, Warp 5, as well as the network, Trek FM. So thank you so much to Norman C. Lau, Floyd Dorsey, Mike Morrison, Tim Cooper, Justin Ozer, Mark Flessa, and Joe Saltzman. We really, really appreciate your support, and we couldn't do it without you. Well, that's all we got for you this week. Stay tuned next week as we continue on with our Season 3 retrospective. So we'll be covering the next 4 episodes of Season 3. And I don't have my list in front of me, so if you give me a second, I'll check it out. Season 3, Part 5. We have a few great guests. We got Patrick joining us, as well as Michael Wong. The episodes we'll cover are Hatchery, Azadi Prime, Damage, and The Forgotten. Well, until next time, Boomers, thanks for listening to Warp 5.